I get to introduce our speaker today, Vincent J. Cannato. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he teaches courses on New York City history, Boston history, immigration history, and 20th century American history. He is the author of American Passage, The History of Ellis Island, HarperCollins 2009, The Ungovernable City, John Lindsay and His Struggle to Save New York, Basic Book 2001, and co-editor of Living in the 80s, Oxford University Press 2009. Professor Cannato has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Post, New York Daily News, National Affairs, Politico, Humanities Magazine, the Weekly Standard, and the New Republic. He has also received a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Apart from his academic career, Professor Cannato was also managing editor of The Public Interest, co-edited by Irving Kristol and Nathan Glazer, co-producer of the PBS documentary The First Measured Century, an aide to former Jersey City Mayor Brent Schundler, and a speechwriter at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University and his BA with honors in political science from Williams College. He lives with his family in Framingham. Speaking this morning on After the Voyage, Immigrants on American Shores, 1880 to 1925, please give a warm brotherhood welcome to Vincent Cannato.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. So today I'm going to talk about immigration, and a lot of this is based off my book, which is called American Passage, The History of Ellis Island, and if anyone's interested, I have a few copies that after the talk, after breakfast, I'm happy to sign. So the talk is After the Voyage, Immigrants on American Shores, 1880 to 1925. I want to talk a little, just briefly about immigration before 1880. Immigration, today ICE has been in the news a lot, so this is a federal issue. It's Washington, D.C. They're in charge of immigration. But before 1880, immigration was largely up to the states. Individual states had their own laws and were charged with enforcing that law. What you have here is in New York, this is Castle Garden. It's at Battery Park, the tip of Manhattan. Castle Garden was run by New York State and by Irish and German immigrant aid societies. They're the ones that processed and inspected immigrants prior to 1890. What happened in the late 1800s to sort of change this? Well, one, we had an increase in the number of immigrants, and we had a shift. Immigrants from Northern Europe earlier, and now immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe coming in the late 1800s. This is some numbers here. You can see by 1905, we're up to 1 million a year, million immigrants. 1907 has 1.3 million immigrants. That's more immigrants than we have this year or recent times, legal immigrants coming to America. And that's on a much smaller country in 1907. America back then was about a quarter the size of what it is today. So that would be like having 5 million immigrants come in 1 year. So this huge increase in the number of immigrants coming at the time. And you can see in the 1880s, 1890s, most immigrants came from Germany, the UK, and Ireland. Just 20 years later, the top 3 countries of origin were Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You've got now new immigrants coming in from different parts of the world. And this is going to cause Americans to start to think about, well, maybe what should we be doing here? Why were these immigrants leaving? Historians talk about push and pull factors. Push factors. One of the big push factors, possibly many of your relatives, left Russia after the pogroms. This is fleeing anti-Semitism in Russia, pushing Jews out of Russia. That's one big push factor. Another push factor is kind of lack of economic opportunities at home. So my family, for instance, coming from southern Italy, left because of poor economic conditions there. Pull factors. What's pulling immigrants to America? Well, one of the things is America is in the second industrial revolution. There's factories, mines booming throughout the North and the Midwest. And there's a huge demand for unskilled and semi-skilled laborers. Another pull factor is family and friends here in America. Immigrants usually come to America because they know people here and they're coming to their family. Another pull factor are religious and political liberties. They can come to America, and although not perfect, this is a place where they're able to exercise freedoms of speech and other freedoms and worship as they choose. Here's a quote. Not all Americans were happy about this. This is a senator from Vermont, Justin Morrill. Not going to read the whole thing, but you can see here, I often ask people, what word or phrase stands out to you as you read this? It's things like inherent deficiencies, iniquities, weak, vile, hungry, outcasts. My favorite is the last one, that these immigrants come here to transmit hereditary taints to the third and fourth generation. That immigrants weren't just poor, right, or they weren't just sickly, but these were genetic flaws that would then be passed down. And not the immigrants might be poor, but their children would be poor, and their grandchildren would be poor, and this would be terrible for the country. So this increase in immigration and this increase in new immigration is causing Americans to say, wow, we have to do something about this immigration. And we have this debate, which in doing my research, I came across this term all the time. Desirable versus undesirable immigrants. Theodore Roosevelt says we cannot have too much immigration of the right kind, and we should have none at all of the wrong kind. That sounds pretty reasonable, but what is immigration of the right kind and what's the wrong kind? That's what you have to figure out. And the United States Congress will begin to pass laws that will state who are the undesirable immigrants. So in 1882, the federal government finally starts to say, we have to do something about immigration. We're going to take it over. We're going to pass laws. The first major law in 1882 barred convicts, lunatics, idiots, or persons unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. I'll explain in a few minutes what they meant by those terms, because they actually did mean something, as weird as it sounds to us today. The other big law was the Chinese Exclusion Act that year. So for almost all immigrants, you had the previous law. But for the Chinese, they had a special law, which banned all Chinese laborers from coming into the country. There had been about 250,000 Chinese immigrants by 1882, and this would severely restrict the number of new Chinese immigrants coming in. This is a cartoon. This is a advertisement for laundry detergent. Uncle Sam kicking, because of course Chinese men were closely associated with the laundry business. That's one of the things, the jobs they held. So they're selling laundry detergent by saying, oh, you can kick out the Chinese by washing your own laundry using our detergent. In 1891, we have another law which expands on this idea of undesirability. Now those excluded included idiots, insane persons, paupers, persons likely to become public charges, persons suffering from a loathsome or dangerous disease, persons convicted of a felony or other infamous crime of misdemeanor involving moral turpitude, and polygamists. That was actually geared, if you want to guess who that was geared to, it was geared towards Mormons. Because Mormons, we don't think of them as immigrants, but some Mormons had left the country. They go around the world to convert, and they're Mormons that live outside of America, so they were very concerned about polygamy. Steamship companies were now fined if they brought immigrants in that got rejected. So steamship companies had an interest in making sure they didn't sell tickets to anyone who couldn't make it into the country. So there are many people in Europe who wanted to come to America but could not. The steamship companies created their own inspection stations in Europe. So before you got a ticket, you had to be inspected in Europe by the steamship companies. Then you got your ticket and could come to America. I found that one year there were estimated as many as 60,000 people were turned away and could not buy tickets to come to America. They would end up going to other countries. England, Canada, Australia, South America, places like Argentina and Brazil took immigrants during this time. There was a lot of movement, a lot of people moving around the world. And then finally, January 1st, 1892, the federal government opens up Ellis Island. And Annie Moore, there's a statue over here, is the first immigrant, an Irish immigrant. She's hailed in the newspapers on the front page as the first immigrant. She comes over with her younger brothers. Her dad is already in New York and meets them. I thought the whole story of Annie Moore was a little bit of a setup story, that she was kind of chosen as the first one. So I went back to look at the steamship she came in on, and in fact there were only about a dozen Irish immigrants. The rest of the immigrants on there were Jews from Russia. So they had stopped over in Ireland, picked up Annie Moore, her brothers, and a few others, and came over. So I thought that was very interesting. And Annie was the first, because now the Irish in 1892 are okay. They're the old immigrants, right? 50 years earlier, the Irish were a huge problem, right? But now they're okay because they're the old immigrants. And now we have new immigrants that Americans are more suspicious of. I'm not going to read this. This is the 1907 law. Again, all these categories of people who would be turned away. 1917, even more. However, there was a literacy test added to the 1917 law. Everyone over 16 had to be able to read in their native language. Anyone want to guess what they were asked to read?
Constitution.
Not the Constitution, good guess. The Bible, right? It's the most translated book in the world. It's good for Christians, it's good for Jews. You can use that. And they actually had different Bible verses for different groups, different ethnic groups, different nationalities, which was also kind of interesting. The 1917 law also extended Chinese exclusion to almost all Asians. So now almost all Asians are barred from coming to the country. Talk a little bit about steamship travel. Immigrants are coming from European ports, kind of like airplane travel today, where there's first class, business class, and then the rest of us in coach. They had levels in these ships: first class, second class, and then third class or steerage. The trip could take about 10 to 14 days, depending on where. For the most part, this is the era of modern steamships. This is not the ships of the mid-1800s, the sailing ships that the Irish came over. These are fairly modern ships. Yes, steerage could be crowded. It was not luxury accommodations, but the steamships had gotten better and better as it went along. When a ship got to New York, this is sort of interesting. The ship would be boarded on the Narrows. This is the Narrows between the Staten Island and Brooklyn. This is where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge goes. The ship would be boarded by immigration officials, public health doctors, that would examine the first and second class passengers. Steamships could not go to Ellis Island. It's too shallow. They would dislodge their passengers at the docks of Manhattan. If you were in first or second class and you'd been inspected already on the ship and you were fine, you were free to go. You did not go to Ellis Island. Ellis Island was for steerage, was for third class passengers, and those first and second class passengers who were either sick or there was some issue with them. So there's this side, not all, because a lot of people in first or second class weren't immigrants. They were tourists, travelers, professionals, for whatever reason. But yes, if you were traveling with a family, you're an immigrant family, and you had grandma with you, and grandma was a little old and maybe a little sickly, you might want to pay a little bit more for a second class ticket for grandma. It might make it a little easier to get past inspection. Another term that we use a lot is birds of passage. These are immigrants that came to America and then went back home, and then sometimes came back to America again, and then sometimes went back home. We think of that with immigrants today because of airline travel, immigrants going back and forth to their homelands. It's a lot easier. But this was not uncommon 120 years ago. It varied, though, from immigrant group to immigrant group. Italians and Greeks had high rates of birds of passage, sometimes up to 40 to 50%. Russian Jews, very small. You were not going to go back to Russia. There was nothing back in Russia that would have you go back. So the different different rates for different groups. There are always the stories of immigrants who were living in Europe who were getting Social Security, this Social Security checks because they worked here for a while and then went back. There's some photos to go through. These are immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. My students have a hard time with this. My students have a hard time with a lot of things, but they have a hard time with this photo. Why? They're so well dressed. They're rich. No. One, they're dressing up because they want to impress. They're going to be inspected. And the second of all, I can say all men wore hats back then, right? When wearing a hat was not a sign of that you were wealthy. Even wearing a suit was not a sign that you were wealthy. But you can see the family here. People would be tagged. How do you keep track of a couple of thousand people every day? You have to have a system that keeps track of them. So they're tagged with their steamship name and the page number of the ship's manifest where their names are located. As soon as they get on the island, they're being watched. This is not one of the myths of Ellis Island is that they are, there's this, really, that everyone got this deep medical inspection. Could not do that with thousands of people. What they got was a cursory inspection as they passed by in a single file line. And you can see the doctors there, the public health service doctors looking, examining. Sometimes they would ask them questions. Sometimes they would poke and prod. What are they looking for? Is someone limping? Is someone out of breath? Is someone hiding a hand that might be deformed? Is someone muttering to themselves? Maybe they have some sort of mental illness. This is what they're looking for. If they think there's a problem, they'll mark them with chalk and they'll be set aside for further inspection. 20% of immigrants were set aside for further inspection. 80% went through in a matter of a couple of hours. Most immigrants did not spend a lot of time at Ellis Island. If you were in that 80%, you would end up in the main hall. It looks a little different today. That staircase isn't there. Those pens are not there. You can see the immigrants have their little tags. They are waiting to see a registry clerk for the final interview, so to speak, before they are officially admitted. And this is the end of the great hallway. These are the half-moon windows looking out on New York Harbor. The men in front of those white books are ships' manifests. If you've done any genealogical research, most likely you've seen those manifests. They include information that the immigrants gave to steamship officials in the European ports. Steamship officials would write them down. The Ellis Island inspectors are reading them and asking the immigrants questions based on that information. They're just looking to make sure that the answers line up and that everything seems okay. Now, there's one problem with this, is that most immigrants didn't speak English, so you had to have a team of interpreters. The man who's staring at us, he's staring right into that camera. His first name is Emil. I don't remember his last name. He's an Ellis Island interpreter. Most of these interpreters spoke multiple languages. Some were immigrants themselves. The most famous interpreter at Ellis Island was Fiorello LaGuardia before he became mayor. He went to law school at NYU at night for 3 years, and for 3 years during the day, he worked at Ellis Island as an interpreter. He spoke English, Italian, Croatian. He had worked as in the chancery in the American chancery over in Croatia, and he spoke Yiddish. His mother was Jewish, so he was multilingual. Sometimes, if there was a problem with an immigrant, they would get a hearing. This is called a Board of Special Inquiry hearing. This is at Ellis Island. Today, this is similar. I won't go into the legal issues, but for immigrants today, when their cases are being heard by administrative judges, not by court judges. Rarely. Sometimes an immigrant case goes into the courts. But there is something called the plenary power doctrine, which meant that the courts were leery of hearing immigrant cases. They only heard cases when there were constitutional issues involved. Instead, most immigrants, whether it's today or 120 years ago, their cases get heard by in an administrative hearing like this. Immigrants could appeal. They could appeal to Washington. They could get their cases appealed. It could last months, during which time they had to be detained at Ellis Island. Sometimes they would be allowed, they would have a hearing, they would be allowed to stay. Sometimes they would be ordered to be deported. Who was coming? What kind of immigrants were coming? This is 1911. You see the number of professionals, very small. Even the number of skilled workers is less than 20%. Most immigrants, the majority of immigrants coming were unskilled workers, farmers, laborers, and then about 250,000 were women and children. This shows you in 1911 how many immigrants got rejected, let's say. Debarred was the term. We talked all about these categories and the inspection. With all of that, less than 2% of immigrants coming through Ellis Island were rejected. So you see here 14,000. In a place like Boston, it was about 1%. In Philly, it was less than 1%. Another thing to look at is in the year 1911, there were a little over 1 million immigrants. More than 75% came through Ellis Island, came through New York. That's why we talk about Ellis Island, because 75% of immigrants came through New York. If you take New York, Philly, Boston, Baltimore, that's about over 90% of all immigrants to America, just coming through the Northeast. If you go down to San Francisco, you'll see something a little different. You'll see 4,000 immigrants. They had something called Angel Island, which was not quite opened yet. Every August, I go and do a workshop with teachers over at Angel Island in San Francisco. Notice how many immigrants were debarred. It was about 25%. And this is because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? This is because there were Chinese immigrants who came over and detained, and their experiences were much different than the immigrants at Ellis Island. They had long, drawn-out hearings. I could give a whole talk on the issue of Chinese immigration and Chinese inspection. Let's briefly talk about some of these categories that we mentioned before that you saw in the law. The two biggest reasons immigrants were turned away was likely to become a public charge and some kind of a disease. So let's look at this term, likely to become a public charge. It's a weird term. It's still in immigration law to this day. The whole concept of American immigration law is based on the idea that immigrants should be self-supporting. Initially, the laws that governed, like state laws, like when Massachusetts was in charge of immigration, these were based on old English poor laws. So in English towns, you would have laws saying if you were a stranger, not an immigrant, a stranger from like the next town over, and you came to my town, if all of a sudden you couldn't take care of yourself, my town did not have to take care of you. We were going to kick you out. You would have to go back to your original town. So that's kind of what likely to become a public charge means. It doesn't mean you're poor. It's a public charge meant someone who was not welfare at the time. There wasn't really welfare, but you were either would be in a poorhouse, a public hospital. It also meant a ward of private charity. You were a charity case, as they said. The other weird thing is likely to become. Not that you are right now, but you will be in the future. It's asking immigration officials to predict which of the people coming in front of them would become, in the future, public charges. That should tell you there's a lot of subjectivity in the law, a lot of room for inspectors to go either way on an immigrant. You could be really, really tough, or you could be really lenient in how you saw them. What would be a public charge? I saw men who were turned away for having hernias. Think about it. If you have a hernia, what can't you do? You can't do physical labor, right? Likely to become a public charge. You're set back. I found another group was often women and children. So if the man was turned away for whatever reason, the husband was turned away for whatever reason, then the women and children would be sent back as likely to become a public charge. Why? The man was the breadwinner. If he couldn't, you couldn't have just the wife and kids because they would end up as public charges. I also found, this is a quote, I found a number of people being turned away for poor physiques. They were weaklings. And partially that's likely to become a public charge, right? They're just too weak to do hard work. But if you read this quote, this also hints at what would become known as eugenics, right? We should be we should be raising people as we raise animals for best in stock, best in breed. We should not be admitting people who are inferior stock. The whole idea of eugenics is the idea of good genes. And when it came to immigration, it meant that officials wanted to keep out those who were believed to have poor genes. People with poor physiques were one of those. Let's look at diseases. Yes, there was cholera, typhus, typhoid fever, but basically you didn't see a lot of this after 1900 because people who were sick were barred from coming in by the steamship companies. So most of the diseases that were caught were pretty minor. Trachoma is not minor, it's not deadly. It can cause blindness. It's a form of conjunctivitis. That's why these inspectors are flipping back the eyelids of immigrants to see if there's any inflammation back there. And favus, which is a disease of the scalp, it just makes you just lose your hair. It's kind of a fungal disease, but it can be seen, right? It's easily seen. So those were the main diseases of people who were sent back. Another law, it was contract labor law. If you come to America as an immigrant and the inspector says, "Do you have a job?" the answer you would think would be, "Yes, of course I have a job." That would be the wrong answer. You were not allowed to have a job in hand when you came to America. Labor unions had been able to lobby for this law in 1885 that banned the importation of contract labor. So the right answer would have been, no, I don't have a job, but I'm going out to Ohio where my cousins are, and they tell me there are lots of jobs out there for someone like me. That's the right answer. But of course, many immigrants did come in with job offers, job promises. But if officials found out about that, they could be debarred. Moral turpitude. This is a quote from Black's Law Dictionary. Some lawyers here. This is kind of like a morals clause in contracts. There's many years ago, somewhere in the Boston suburbs, there was an assistant principal at a public school who was fired because he had a morals clause in his contract. What did he do wrong? He was arrested for drunk driving. So the district was like, nope, that violates this clause in your contract. That's sort of basically what moral turpitude is. It's another thing where there's a lot of leeway in how you can define this. One way that immigration officials defined it was in areas of sexuality, adultery, premarital sex, out-of-wedlock births. This is an interesting thing. If you were a woman and you were coming to Ellis Island by yourself, you could not leave the island alone. You could only leave if you were escorted by a male relative, father, brother, uncle, close male relative. The idea was that women needed to be protected. This is the Victorian era ideas of sexuality. Women needed protection. So you could not just send an immigrant girl off into New York all by herself because what might happen? Similarly, there were lots and lots, hundreds of shotgun marriages at Ellis Island. Men and women who were not married. So say a young man, a young woman, boyfriend, girlfriend come over together on the ship. If inspectors were able to figure out that relationship, they would say, you can only come in if you get married, and married right here. Now, this is another thing that baffles my students a lot, and understandably so, because this is a different era. The idea was, again, about protecting women, right? That if you forced the man to marry the woman here, now if they were able to go off on their own, what would stop the boyfriend from abandoning the girlfriend and moving on? Now, you would say today, the woman would rebound and she'd make a life for herself. But back then, 120 years ago, right, that woman would be, for want of a better term, damaged goods. She would have a tough time marrying somebody, right? And again, the fear is might end up in a life of prostitution. So yes, men and women were forced to get married. There's a case of I think they were Eastern Orthodox. The man was already in the country. He was somewhere in the Midwest. He saved up enough money to bring his soon-to-be wife and child, they had a child out of wedlock, bring them over. And he sent an affidavit to Ellis Island saying, when they come to Ohio, it was actually from their priest, I will marry them. Not good enough. You come from Ohio to New York and you get married right here. You can go back to Ohio and have your celebration and your formal ceremony, but you've got to get married here. And he had to come to New York and marry his girlfriend there on the island. This was a term that was used, I'm using it because it was used at the time, mental defectives. We're talking about mental disabilities, mentally handicapped. This is where the terms idiots and imbecile come in. We saw that in the law. It's basically talking about intelligence testing. And Ellis Island is really the first place in America that does widespread intelligence testing. IQ tests begin in France. They're kind of imported into America, and it's starting around 1907, 1908. They're starting to be given to immigrants at Ellis Island. Like right here, the man in the middle is Dr. Howard Knox. He's a doctor at Ellis Island. The man on the right's an immigrant. The man on the left is the interpreter. They're trying to figure out the intelligence of this immigrant on the right, and they're giving him a series of tests. To the credit of Ellis Island officials, they understood the trickiness of intelligence testing. How do you measure the intelligence of people who don't speak English, many of whom have never had any formal schooling before? And one of the things they did, as they're doing here, is lots of nonverbal tests, lots of jigsaw puzzles like you see here, basic jigsaw puzzles, where the immigrant is timed, how many mistakes did they make. This is again where eugenics comes in. The idea that that America wants to keep out those who have low intelligence because this will bring down, it was believed, the intelligence of the entire nation. A little bit about Boston, because we talked about New York, but Boston had its own laws and then would enforce, after 1891, enforce the federal law. Initially, immigrants came down to the wharfs downtown, like Long Wharf and India Wharf, and there would be an informal inspection down there. After 1891, immigration law is now federalized, but there really isn't an Ellis Island in Boston. There's no dorms for detainees. If you were detained for any medical reason, you'd be sent out to one of the harbor islands, Gallops Island. Finally, in 1920, Boston gets an immigration station, a lot different than Ellis Island. This is basically where the airport is now. It's on Massport property, much less iconic than Ellis Island. But Boston saw far fewer immigrants per year than Ellis Island. This is about what happened when immigrants came here. Where did many of them lived in tenements? Tenement is just a name for a multiple story dwelling housing more than 3 families, usually 4 to 6 stories in height. They were the predominant mode of housing for immigrants living in urban areas, living in cities like New York or Chicago or Boston. We know a lot about tenements because of this man, who's Jacob Riis. He was a Danish immigrant who is a reformer, and he took photos of the slums of New York and published them in a book called How the Other Half Lives. Many of you in this audience will understand this. I can't unsee that Jacob Riis looks a lot like Cliff Clavin from Cheers. Right? So there's Cliffy, there's Jacob, Cliffy, Jacob. So here are some of the famous Riis, not Cliff Clavin photos, but Jacob Riis photos of New York tenement living. And Riis was trying to highlight the terrible conditions that the immigrant poor were living in New York. This is Bandit's Roost. Not only was it terrible, it could also be dangerous. Here are a number of immigrant men. I try to have my students count. There's about 7 or 8 men in this tiny photo. They're all cramped together. Why? They're trying to save money. They're saving money so they could either go back as birds of passage to their home country or save money to bring their families over. This is a pattern we see today with immigrants as well, living in overcrowded conditions to save money to send back home. This is a family living in a tenement in New York. This is not just a living space, it's a factory. The home is a home and it's a place of work. The man is a cigar roller. And he has his young boy who's helping him, who is also rolling cigars here at the home. Riis did not think this was a good thing, but this was a very bad thing. He thought that tenement living was bad for children. A lot of these photos are kind of staged. This is a staged photo. You can see the boys laughing. They're like your typical street urchins of the time. Now, there's another way to look at this, and there's plenty of firsthand reminiscence of people who grew up this way. They thought they had a wonderful childhood living in the streets of New York. It was great. This is sort of like if you've ever seen the movie or play Newsies, right? These would be like the Newsies guys, you know. It was great. They loved it. They had lots and lots of kids. You had lots of family around. But Reese is looking at it from a very specific perspective. This is another immigrant group, another immigrant family in a tenement in New York. I always like to say in this photo, well, first of all, you can see there's China in the top left. Yeah, this family is living in a not great tenement, but they have kind of aspirations for something more. And many immigrants would leave the tenements after they earned enough money to get to a slightly better place to live. That was common. Most people did not spend their whole lives living in tenements. I also like to ask, this is a Reese photo, I like to say, what did this family think about life in the tenements? And the answer is we have no idea because Reese didn't ask them. He just took the photo, and so we don't know what they thought. This is Mulberry Bend down in lower Manhattan. A lot of Reese's photos were taken within a block or two of here. And Reese was able to get public action to do something about these neighborhoods. And what they did was tear down. You can see the Bend is on the right, the upper right. You can see that's Mulberry Bend. They tore down a whole row of tenements to put in a park, which is today called Columbus Park. This is now part of Chinatown in New York. Open space, places for kids to play, great, but a lot of people lost their homes in this as well. This is an important chart, important statistic. The orange line is Boston, the yellow line is Massachusetts, and the blue line is the nation. This looks at the percentage of foreign-born in the country, city, or state over time. And you can see in 1890, 1900, 1910, the percentage of foreign-born in America is about 14 to 15%. In Massachusetts, it gets up to 31%, and in Boston, it's 36%. And then there's a decline. There's a huge decline. That gray part are the quota years, because in the 1820s, there are quotas put on immigration. And the percentage of foreign-born dips down by 1970 in the nation to 5%. So in 1970, only 5% of Americans were immigrants. And in Boston, it was down to 13%, Massachusetts 9%. That's because we had restricted for the previous 40 years immigrant pretty heavily. And then you see a rise after 1970. Today, the percentage of Americans who are foreign-born is about 15 to 16%. So we're up to that historic high after about 30 years of pretty high immigration. Very quickly, what happened in the 1920s? Well, you had the rise of nativism, anti-immigrant feeling. A lot of it centered here in Boston. The Immigration Restriction League was founded by 3 Harvard grads. I don't know if we have any Harvard grads here. Kind of a defender of Anglo-Saxon America, heavily influenced by eugenics. This is Prescott Hall, who is one of the leaders of the Immigration Restriction League. So it's really after World War I that this kind of nativism really gained steam in America. And in 1921, there's a quota law passed. These are complex laws, 3%. Each country would have a quota based on 3% of that nationality that lived in America in 1910. Then in 1924, they tightened it by saying 2% based on 1890. You can think about why they did that. There are a lot fewer Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans in 1890. So the quotas for those countries are going to be really small. The quotas for Northern European are going to be much higher. There's also a cap on the total number of immigrants that can come in. 1924 also sees the introduction of a visa system. So now you no longer, if you want to come to America, you go to the American consulate in your home country and you get inspected and you get a visa. So there's no need for an Ellis Island anymore. There's no need as a primary inspection facility. Ellis Island, there's fewer immigrants, less need for inspection. Ellis Island is a way station for those immigrants who are now being deported back to their home. And in 1954, Ellis Island will close for good. And I'll leave you with 2 cartoons. This is a cartoon about the quotas of the 1920s. You see the teeming masses of Europe trying to get through this funnel, and there's Uncle Sam with the 3% gate, the 3% quotas, and that only lets in a handful of immigrants who make it through that gate. And then there's this one, which I think came from the New Yorker. This is Plymouth, 1620. The Indian says to the pilgrim, "You can't come in. The quota for 1620 is full." And I will end with my book, which is for sale, $15. There's a little bit of a discount off the hardcover, of the softcover price. I'm happy to sign them. Otherwise, I think we're ready for questions.
Great presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
When did illegal immigration become an issue from this, and how did it grow? Because obviously when you put a gate, people are desperate to find a way around the gate.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Illegal immigration happens when you get tighter laws, tougher laws. So there's going to be illegal immigration with Chinese immigration. When you have tight laws on Chinese immigration, you're going to have Chinese immigrants trying to find ways around them. There's a whole system of, they're called paper sons, whole system that comes up to get Chinese immigrants in by claiming that they're the son of a Chinese immigrant already in the country. The quota laws are going to create illegal immigration, and people who are going to try to get around the quotas. There is a system, I mean, I don't want to go into too much, I can go in, but there's a system that's created in around 1920 to legalize illegal immigrants, basically. So there was a story I found of an Italian woman who came in under the quota years under someone else's passport, someone who was actually a citizen. So in the 30s, she went to become a citizen. They went back in, they couldn't find her entry. They couldn't find any, because she had come in illegally with someone else's passport. So she had to go to Canada for a night. So she went to Canada, stayed a night, and then re-entered the country legally, and then was able to go on a path to becoming a citizen. So there were about 250,000 people between the 1920s and the 1960s who were able to regularize themselves or legalize themselves in that way. Another famous example, the most famous example of an illegal immigrant is Bela Lugosi, the actor. He jumped ship. He was working on a ship. He jumped ship somewhere. I think it might have been New Orleans. Just jumped ship. He was never processed. He never went through the process. Then he went to be a citizen and couldn't do it, so he had to go to Ellis Island, present himself as an immigrant, be processed, and then he was legalized. So that's the backstory. But illegal immigration doesn't become a big issue. It starts to be an issue in the 1980s. And what ends up happening is the 1965 immigration law, which was a liberal law in some ways, what it did was, so the quotas were only for Europe and the rest of the Western Hemisphere had no quotas. There were no quotas for Mexico, Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean. Now, after 1965, all the countries are under quotas, and we have this today, but all the quotas are the same. So now Mexico had quotas after 65. It became a lot harder to get into the country if you were Mexican after that because there were quotas. So that's going to really boost up illegal immigration. It's really hard to get into the country after 1965 if you're Irish. Why? Because because you could get into the country after 65 if you were a skilled worker or you knew someone, you had a close relative already here. The Irish were largely unskilled, and Irish immigration had stopped years ago. They didn't have many people. So there's a huge wave of, the Irish hated Ted Kennedy they hated him over busing, and they hated him over this because Kennedy was a big proponent of the 65 Act, and it really hurt Irish immigration. They ended up, this is why you get the diversity lottery in the 80s. This comes out of this. So that's kind of a long answer to that. But the 80s see it as a much bigger political issue. And you're up to about 2 million illegal immigrants, 2 to 3 in the 1980s.
Morning.
Hi.
Really quite interesting.
Thank you.
When you were talking about the quotas back in the 20s, and they used, I think you said the 1890 census, was the quota per ethnic group, or was it just a total? So that if you were 10% of the people in the country in 1890 and you were Jewish, that's all some percentage of that?
It was by nationality, not by ethnicity. So if you were Jewish, it was, if you were if you were German Jewish, you'd have a better chance than if you were Russian Jewish. So because the German quota was much higher than Russia. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions. One, both of my mother's grandfathers came over as immigrants, and they were both rabbis. Were they considered professionals, or how does rabbi count? And
Yeah, I think professionals. Yes.
I think so too. Based on paperwork I've
Yeah.
seen, they were interviewing other employable, et cetera. The second thing that I wanted to ask is, how much was there around the immigration by nationality? Because my mother's grandfather's side, he actually always told people he was from Sweden, even though his family was from Poland, because he lived in Sweden for a while, and then he got in, I think, an easier path through Sweden.
And when was this? When did he come?
Early 1900s.
Oh, okay, so this is also a complicated story. So American government categorized immigrants based on nationality and race. What they called race is something we would call ethnicity. So if you were an immigrant coming in, let's say your grandfather, he would probably be categorized as Swedish for nationality, but Hebrew for race. Hebrew was considered a race. But your nationality could be German and Hebrew, Polish and Hebrew, Russian and Hebrew. So wherever you went, your nationality could change depending on where you were, under whose sovereignty you were living, but your race could never change. And that was sort of the controversial aspect of that. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Thank you. Forgive my ignorance, what was the reason the United States was so against letting in Chinese and later I see all Asians?
So good question. So my answer for Chinese exclusion, there are two things going on. One is racism, right? The Chinese were seen as too different racially to assimilate into America. That was one thing. They just seen as alien who could never. And you read through the arguments. Yes, they will quite say very easily, no, the Chinese will never become Americans. Will never assimilate, and we can't live side by side with a group that won't assimilate. The other reason is economic. So it's often labor unions, especially on the West Coast, that are really carrying the banner for Chinese exclusion. They see Chinese immigrants as this, sort of as we see China today. China's a huge country. It was a big country back then, as a pool of unskilled labor that American businesses could just tap and bring over to undercut the wages of American workers. So you put those two things together and you get exclusion. And then later, the Asian exclusion was just the variation of the first thing, the race thing. They're not going to assimilate. They're not going to assimilate into America. So let's.
The unions were by.
And unions also. Yep. Yeah.
Sorry, a quick follow-up
Yeah.
on my question. Perhaps I didn't phrase it correctly. Based upon the response you gave to somebody about being a Polish Hebrew, a German Hebrew, or whatever, were then, going back to that, were Hebrews in all, whether they were Polish, German, Russian, whatever.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to.
Sorry. No, the quotas were by nationality, not by race. So there would not be a Hebrew quota. It would only be a quota on Germans or on Poles by nationality. Does that answer? Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't clear.
Regarding Chinese people, I think somewhere in the 1800s, there were many Chinese people who came to build the railroad that went across the western part of the country, I think. And I'm wondering what status did they have in terms of immigration?
Yeah, no, so they would have come over in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, helped to build the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. And when that was done, they would go, many of them went off to the cities, they opened restaurants, or they became in the laundry business. They would have come over legally, as these would have been legal immigrants, with a catch. Asian immigrants could not naturalize. They could not be citizens. Citizenship originally, going back to the 1790s, was for whites only. Then during Reconstruction, it was because citizenship in America was extended to African Americans. So now if you were a black immigrant from, let's say, Jamaica, you could become a citizen, but Asians could not become citizens. What their children, if their children were born here, they would automatically become citizens. But you could not become a naturalized citizen. Yep. So that's the catch there. And that would be the case until about the 1940s. There's this wonderful, crazy Supreme Court story from the 1920s of an Indian man who is denied. He said he can't become a naturalized citizen. And he says, no, I'm Caucasian. Indians are classified as Caucasians. And so it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, you can't become naturalized. And they basically say, you don't look white, so you're not white. That's basically what they say. It's called the Thind decision, Thindh, I think. It's fascinating. Yeah.
Still on the books.
Well, it's still a case. It's not law today because now anyone can become There's no racial basis for naturalization. Yeah.
Just a quick question. My name is Goldberg, but it's not the family name. And I wonder, did they have to change their names before they got on the boat? Because I've heard that they did not change them, when they arrived here.
Thank you. That is the number one question that I get. I've been giving these talks for a long time. I get that and it's the biggest myth associated with Ellis Island, the name change myth. And I can say 99% certainty, there might be an exception here or there, that immigrants' names were not changed at Ellis Island because there was no mechanism in the inspection process to legally change someone's name. Remember, the ship's manifests were created in Europe by the steamship companies. They were brought over, the inspectors just read them. They weren't keeping a list at Ellis Island of all the immigrants coming through and writing them down. That's not how it went. There's a very funny story, some of you might have heard this, that became kind of a vaudeville story of the Jewish immigrant named Sean Ferguson, right? So he arrives at Ellis Island, he's really nervous, they ask him his name, and he says, Sean Ferguson, I forgot. Sean Ferguson, here you go. Never happened. But it's a great old vaudeville. There's another, this one I got to read out. It's in my book. I think it's a Jewish immigrant. His name was Sam Ting, because he said, what's your name? He said, same thing, and the same thing. So there's a lot of jokes that were involved. Now, immigrants did change their names. A lot of them changed their own names, right? They Americanized their names once they got here. Some changed their names in Europe. Right, there was a lot of name changes going over there. Who you were, like if I asked you, who are you? And I said, prove it, you would just pull out your wallet, you'd give me IDs, driver's licenses, right? Who you are is pretty solid. There's a lot of 120, 150 years ago, there isn't that. You could kind of be who you wanted to be. And that was good for a lot of people who wanted to escape their old lives. Now, I will say one caveat because it's and I've heard from so many people who, my grandmother told me this story, and I don't want to say your grandmother's wrong. That doesn't make me happy. Because I hear this so often, perhaps what might have happened is when people went to naturalize, they want to become citizens, and that is where if you know someone who's become a naturalized citizen, you get documentation, you get paperwork with your name on it. Perhaps at that time, and that's immigration officials years later, maybe some immigration officials might have changed people's names at naturalization. I have no evidence for that. It's just a speculation because it's such a widely held story by many Americans. So that's... Anyone else? Did someone else?
Well, you reminded me. So my whole family came over from Ukraine, and they're all seagulls. 5 brothers and a whole bunch. So I've been wondering this question my whole life, and I'm not sure you answered it because what happened to the whole crew that came over? And we've since found out the name. I can't remember right now what it is. But how did that happen? How did they just come in under a different name?
Wait, so they came in, when was their name changed, do you think?
I don't know when it was. All I know is that they came over in the 1890s,
right?
In the 1800s, somewhere around there. They settled, and they were all seagulls. So they're all over the place, but I know that they couldn't possibly have that name, and I was just wondering.
Perhaps before they left, they changed it. Have you looked at the ship's manifest?
Unfortunately, I have not had the chance to do that, and my aunt who passed away, who would have had a lot of that information, we didn't realize how important it was till she was gone, and my father, they never wanted to talk about any of that because they just wanted to be American.
That's very common. But yeah, it would be interesting to look at the manifest to see what shows up. I had a friend who she was adopted, but had discovered her birth family, and they came from Hungary. And I'm trying to remember the exact story, but basically the great-great-grandfather's name was something like Lincoln Abraham, and it's somewhere, and then it became it changed, in many ways. I mean, obviously Abraham was probably, or Abram, something was the name originally, but it evolved, and of course Lincoln Abraham is, a very American thing, and then it changed again once they're here. Yeah, who you are evolved. The last thing I'll say, my grandfather was born in Italy, and his name was my name, Vincent Cannato. But everyone called him Joe. He actually didn't have a middle name. We found his birth certificate. No, they just call him Joe. I don't know why. It's just call him Joe. That was, and it's even more complicated because our name was originally Cannato. He was adopted. His birth name is Cannato, but he grew up with a different name, his adopted family's name. And then when he was 16, he said, I love my adopted family, but I want to have my birth name. And he changed it back to Cannato. So this going back and forth, changing your identity, is something that people did at the time. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.